Welcome back to Sci-Fi Stories. Dear listeners, sadly, YouTube has demonetized our channel, leaving us without the budget to keep the lights on. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hard-working team to survive and keep creating these tales for you. You can help by scanning the donate QR code on your screen or clicking the link in the video description or comments. To die in the void of space is a quiet, sterile thing. But to die under the hyper-pressurized ice oceans of Gliese 884 is a loud, agonizing crush. Down here, billions of tons of freezing black water wait to turn thick titanium into crumpled foil. We were not hunted by organic monsters craving the taste of warm flesh. We were hunted by shapes that simply did not belong in the natural order. Lurking in a darkness so absolute and crushing, it felt like a physical weight pressing against the surface of our eyes. I am Vale. I speak not with vocal cords or sound waves, but through the shifting, luminous hues of my bioluminescent dermal layers. Right now, my entire skin pulsed in rapid, erratic waves of deep violet and sickly yellow, broadcasting my mounting, instinctual terror into the cramped, freezing cabin of our aging exploration submersible. The vessel groaned in protest around us. A continuous, metallic shriek echoed through the hull as we descended further and further into the abyssal trench of this frozen hell. Beside me sat Cameron Blood. She was a human, a xenobiological engineer hailing from the infamous Deathworld known as Earth. While my entire being flooded the suffocating cabin with the frantic, dancing light of primal anxiety, Cameron was an absolute void of emotion. She sat in the pilot seat, perfectly still, her face illuminated only by the harsh, artificial green glow of the instrument panels. She did not tremble. Her breathing was calculated, slow, and devastatingly shallow. Her bare hands manipulated the complex array of dials, valves, and joysticks with a terrifying, mechanical grace. She possessed the chilling composure of an apex predator born on a planet that constantly, violently tried to kill its own inhabitants. Suspended in the nutrient-dense gel of the navigation tank directly behind our seats was Kalen. He was of my kin, glowing in soft, rhythmic patterns, but he was gifted with the rare genetic mutation of true telepathy. He was our pathfinder in the pitch black, navigating the treacherous thermal vents and crushing downward currents, not by primitive sight, but by feeling the quantum vibrations of the water itself. More importantly, he was Cameron's closest companion. Theirs was a silent bond forged in the deadly depths of a dozen hostile worlds. I could feel his gentle, reassuring psychic hum brushing against the frayed edges of my consciousness. A soft lullaby of pale blue light attempting to soothe my frantic violet flashes. "We are passing the thermal boundary," Cameron stated, her voice a flat, synthesized translation coming through my auditory implant, completely devoid of inflection. "External pressure is currently at 4,000 atmospheres. Hull integrity is holding steady." Then, the universe simply ended. It did not happen with a violent explosion. There was no fiery climax, no roaring proximity alarm, just a sudden, vicious cessation of everything. An electromagnetic pulse of impossible, devastating magnitude swept through the freezing water. Every single screen in the cabin went instantly dead. The artificial gravity failed, leaving a sickening sensation in my core. The life support air scrubbers choked, sputtered, and fell utterly silent. The only illumination left in the suffocating black was my own terrified, blinding white bioluminescence. The silence that followed was the heaviest thing I had ever experienced in my long life. Without the low hum of the engine to fight back, the true weight of the ocean pressed in on us with malicious intent. Billions of tons of freezing water squeezed our fragile titanium shell from every conceivable angle. The metal began to pop and sing, a horrific acoustic symphony of structural integrity pushed to its absolute breaking point. I expected the human to panic, to scream or smash her fragile fists against the dead, useless consoles. Instead, Cameron merely exhaled a slow, steady breath and reached up for the manual override levers in the pitch dark, her heartbeat not quickening by a single fraction of a second. "Look out the starboard viewport," Cameron commanded, her voice cutting through the suffocating, freezing dark without a single tremor of fear. I floated forward and pressed my face against the freezing, reinforced polyglass, my skin glowing a pale, terrified blue to pierce the abyss outside. What I saw defied every known law of biology and physics. Out there, in the freezing, hyper-pressurized depths where nothing should survive, shadows were moving. They were not organic shapes of muscle, fin, and scale. They were perfectly geometric, sharply angled crystalline forms, gliding gracefully through the black water. They moved with terrifying, impossible speed. Yet they disturbed absolutely nothing. There was no hydrodynamic wake, no displaced currents, no sound of water parting. They cut through the dense ocean like ethereal scalpels through the vacuum of space. These were not predators of flesh and blood. They were the apex beasts of a silicon nightmare, and they had found us. The breach was absolutely silent. No metal groaned in protest. No proximity alarms warned us of an impact. A perfect ring of sickly green light simply bloomed on the starboard wall. It was a molecular dissociation acid. The thick titanium did not bend or shatter. It simply ceased to exist. It dissolved into a fine, silvery mist. A perfectly circular hole opened directly into the void. The hyper-pressurized ocean violently invaded the cabin. Freezing black water slammed into us. The temperature plunged to near zero instantly. The sheer physical force of the inward rush picked me up and threw me against the ceiling panels. Panic hijacked my biology. Rational thought died. Ancient survival instincts took complete control of my body. My skin betrayed me. I began to flash. Brilliant bursts of blinding white and neon crimson erupted from my pores. I could not suppress the light. In the pitch black of the flooding submersible, I became a frantic beacon. I painted a massive target on myself. Outside in the deep, the geometric shadows stopped their graceful circling. Their sharp, faceless heads snapped toward my light. They moved toward the breach. Their movements were perfectly, terrifyingly synchronized. A heavy physical force slammed into my side. I crashed hard into a bank of dead monitors. It was Kalen. He had ripped himself out of his shattered navigation tank. Thick nutrient gel poured onto the metal deck, mixing with the violently churning seawater. He shoved me roughly out of the direct line of sight. Then, Kalen ignited. He did not just glow. He detonated. He unleashed a massive burst of pure life energy. It was a biological and telepathic supernova. Brilliant azure and gold light flooded the tiny, sinking space. His mental scream blasted through my mind. It was a calculated shockwave of psychic noise, designed to draw their absolute attention away from me. The apex beasts swarmed through the perfectly round hole. Close up, they were a severe violation of nature. They lacked flesh, blood, or bone. They were constructed entirely of jagged silicon facets and dark crystal matrices. They moved without creating a single ripple. They ignored the ruined ship. They ignored my frantic flashing. They completely ignored the human standing at the helm. They cared only for Kalen and the massive energy signature he was broadcasting. They did not attack with claws or teeth. Several of the crystalline entities raised their angular limbs. A web of crackling black energy shot forward. It was an electromagnetic isolation membrane. The dark net struck Kalen. It wrapped tightly around his glowing body. Instantly, his brilliant blue light was smothered. Total darkness reclaimed that corner of the room. Worse, his telepathic presence was abruptly severed. The comforting warmth of his mind was violently cut out of my head. It left a hollow, bleeding ache in my consciousness. The beasts reversed their trajectory without turning around. They dragged his bound, struggling form back through the breach. They sank rapidly into the abyssal trench, pulling him down into the lightless cracks of the ocean floor. I clung to a thick support beam. The freezing water rapidly rose past my waist. Red emergency lights finally flickered to life. A backup klaxon started to scream. It was a piercing, rhythmic howl. I stared at the dark hole in the hull. I waited for the human to react. I braced myself for the chaotic explosion of human grief. I knew the xenology texts. Humans were fiercely bonded to their pack members. When they lost someone they loved, they descended into emotional anarchy. I expected Cameron to drop to her knees in the freezing water. I expected her to wail, to tear at her suit, to curse the uncaring universe. I fully expected her to grab a useless plasma cutter and dive recklessly into the void, driven by a blind, illogical need to save him. Cameron did nothing of the sort. She did not scream. She did not shed a single tear. Her breathing did not quicken. She stood absolutely rigid in the rising water. Her face was a blank, terrifying mask of carved stone. The flashing red lights reflected in her eyes, but her gaze held zero emotion. She moved with agonizing deliberation. She waded through the flooded deck. The heavy water dragged at her thick suit, but her steps were perfectly steady. She reached the central command console. She raised one bare fist and smashed a heavy manual override switch. The screaming klaxon died instantly. The sudden silence was heavier and colder than the deep ocean outside. The only sound left was the quiet gurgling of freezing water filling the lower compartments. Cameron turned her back on the gaping hole in our ship. She turned her back on the black abyss where Kalen had just vanished. She reached down to her tactical belt. Her hands did not tremble. She pulled out a handheld environmental diagnostic scanner. She walked calmly to the very edge of the breached hull. She ignored the vast, empty ocean outside. Instead, she pointed the scanner directly at the perfectly round, glowing edges of the melted metal. She narrowed her eyes. She began to meticulously measure the residual thermal signatures left behind by the molecular acid. The freezing water had now reached my chest. The agonizing cold was secondary to the gaping void in my mind, where Kalen had always been. I knew what the severing of a telepathic bond meant. In the history of our species, such a violent disconnection only occurred at the exact moment of physical destruction. He was gone. The abyssal trench had claimed him. I closed my eyes against the harsh red emergency lighting and began the ritual of severance. Deep within my chest cavity, I vibrated the core acoustic organ of my species. I let out a low, mournful resonance. It was the death dirge of the luminescent tide. My skin shifted into a slow, somber pulse of pale gray and muted indigo. I sang for his scattered atoms. I sang for his lost light. I prepared to accept the end of all things in this metal tomb. Cameron did not join my mourning. She completely ignored the sacred harmonics echoing through the flooded cabin. The human had already finished her forensic scan of the hull breach. She waded past me, the heavy water dragging against her reinforced diving suit, and approached the primary navigation console. The panel was dead, completely fried by the electromagnetic pulse. But Cameron did not see a ruined machine. She saw raw materials. She pulled a heavy kinetic wrench from her belt and smashed the reinforced glass cover of the terminal. The brutal, violent sound shattered my mournful song. She reached into the tangled guts of the machine. Her hands moved with terrifying, mechanical efficiency. She ripped out the primary communication motherboard. Sparks hissed and died as they touched the rising seawater. She stripped the thick insulating rubber off a cluster of copper optical wires, using only her teeth and the edge of a specialized utility blade. She took the exposed, jagged ends of the ship's communication array and forcefully shoved them into the auxiliary data ports integrated directly into the armored collar of her own deep-sea diving suit. She was hot-wiring her own life support system to the corpse of the submarine. Her suit powered up with a sharp electrical whine. She had turned her own body into an improvised, high-gain radio wave receiver. Her eyes darted across a tiny heads-up display projected on the inside of her reinforced helmet visor. The harsh, green light painted her face in ghastly shadows. "Stop singing! Vile!" she commanded. Her voice was utterly devoid of warmth. "Your acoustic vibrations are creating micro-fluctuations in the local water density. It is interfering with my telemetry." I choked off the sacred resonance. I stared at her in utter disbelief. My pale gray skin flashed a jagged, angry crimson. "He is gone, Cameron. His light is extinguished. We must honor the empty space he left behind." "He is not gone," Cameron replied flatly, her eyes never leaving her internal display. "The residual thermal decay on the hull breach indicates the entities utilized a localized quantum disruption field to bypass our armor. Furthermore, my suit receiver is currently picking up a faint, highly organized trail of localized radioactive isotopes, moving downward at exactly 85 knots. She turned to face me. The green light of her visor made her look entirely inhuman. "They did not eat him, Vielle. Based on their movement vectors and the specific frequency of the electromagnetic pulse they used to cripple us, I have categorized the enemy. Those are not natural predators. They are an obsolete, dying network of synthetic biological artificial intelligence. Their crystalline matrices are degrading. Their central processing nodes are failing due to extreme age and deep ocean pressure. They do not hunt for organic sustenance." I did not understand. "Then why did they take him?" Cameron walked over to a section of the bulkhead that had completely frozen over due to the surrounding ocean temperatures. She raised a thick, armored finger. She began to write on the frost-covered metal. She drew complex, jagged lines of thermodynamic equations and variable matrices. She calculated the pressure, the temperature, the rate of Kalen's biological metabolism, and the estimated processing power of the silicon hive. "They took him for his brain," she stated, her voice as hard as the ice she was writing on. "They detected his immense telepathic output. They recognized a highly advanced, biologically resilient neural network. They are going to drag him into their central hive core. They are going to forcefully graft his cerebral cortex into their failing system. They intend to use his living mind as a replacement central processing unit to keep their network alive." I recoiled physically. The water splashed around me. The horror of her words was paralyzing. Being eaten was a natural end. Being assimilated, being turned into a living battery for a swarm of dying machines, was an eternity of torture. Cameron finished her final equation. She tapped her finger violently against the frost. "Based on the biological resistance of your species against foreign organic integration, his neural pathways will hold out for a specific duration before complete synchronization occurs. We have exactly 47 hours until Kalen's mind is permanently erased and overwritten by the Silicon Collective." I shuddered in absolute terror, not just at the fate of my friend, but at the creature standing in front of me. The human had not shed a single tear. She had not offered a single word of comfort. She had simply dissected the tragedy into raw numbers and cold facts. I looked at her rigid posture, her emotionless face, and the clinical equations smeared across the ice. I realized the xenology texts had been wrong. Humans were not passionate pack animals. They were cold-blooded, calculating machines wearing skin. They were completely incapable of feeling the agonizing weight of true grief. "You are a monster," I whispered, my bioluminescence turning a sickening, faint yellow. "Your heart is as frozen as this ocean. Do you feel absolutely nothing for him?" Cameron stopped wiping the frost from her gauntlet. She did not turn her head. She kept her eyes fixed on the black water churning outside the shattered viewport. "Grief is a luxury for the surface," Cameron replied, her tone perfectly even, devoid of a single crack of sorrow. "Down here, we only have variables." I begged the human to reconsider. I pleaded with her to blow the emergency ballast tanks, to let the natural buoyancy of the remaining air pockets violently propel our ruined vessel back toward the surface. We needed to reach the orbital relay satellite. We needed to warn the fleet. But Cameron did not even acknowledge my frantic, pulsing orange light. Instead of initiating an emergency ascent, she waded through the freezing, chest-high water toward the manual pneumatic levers located near the flooded deck. She grasped the heavy iron handles and pulled them backward with brutal, mechanical force. The submarine groaned in agonizing protest. The sound of high-pressure air venting from our external tanks echoed like a dying breath. We were not escaping. Cameron was forcing our crippled, metal tomb to sink even deeper into the lightless maw of the monster's lair. The abyssal trench swallowed us whole. The water pressure outside the shattered viewport climbed to absolutely catastrophic levels, promising instant annihilation if the remaining bulkheads failed. She did not sit idle while we plummeted into the abyss. Cameron transformed the flooded command deck into a makeshift laboratory of survival. She moved with a chilling, hyper-focused intensity. She dismantled the ruined secondary communication arrays, ripping out handfuls of wet copper wire, quartz modulators, and lithium microbatteries. Using only her hardened gloves and a portable laser welder, she began twisting these scavenged components together. She was constructing crude, jagged amalgamations of hardware. "Hold this," she ordered, shoving a heavy cluster of exposed wiring into my trembling hands. "I am reconfiguring these raw microprocessors to broadcast a localized electromagnetic frequency. I am manipulating the output to mimic the exact amplitude and wavelength of your species' telepathic alpha waves. These are dummy nodes. I am building fake brains." Once she finished assembling 5 of these crude devices, she walked to the edge of the gaping, acid-melted hole in our hull. She tossed the first dummy node directly into the freezing, hyper-pressurized void. It vanished into the black water. We stood in the dark, waiting. I dimmed my bioluminescence to a terrifyingly pale gray, terrified of drawing their attention. Less than 2 minutes later, a sharply angled, geometric shadow darted past the viewport. A Silicon Scout had arrived. It did not strike the dummy node with physical force. Instead, it deployed a web of crackling dark energy, enveloping the tiny metal bundle exactly as it had enveloped Kalen. Cameron did not flinch. She watched the data stream scrolling rapidly across the heads-up display inside her helmet visor. Her eyes darted back and forth, absorbing the raw telemetry. "Fascinating," she whispered, her voice tight with morbid curiosity. "Look at the data absorption rate. The entity is not destroying the hardware. It is systematically dismantling the data architecture of the node. It is trying to read the fake neural pathways. I am recording the exact sequence of the decryption algorithm it is using to process our bait." She dropped a second node, then a third. Each time, a new crystalline scout intercepted the bait within moments. But after the third interception, Cameron frowned. The harsh green light of her visor illuminated the deep furrows on her forehead. She stopped moving. "Something is critically wrong with their response time," she muttered, tapping the side of her helmet. "I intentionally altered the emission frequency on the third node by 2.5%. It was a complex variable shift. The scout that intercepted it adjusted its decryption matrix instantly to compensate, but the localized data transfer logs show zero latency. I did not understand the human engineering terminology. Zero latency. What does that mean in this context?" "It means there was absolutely no transmission delay," Cameron explained, turning her face toward me. The realization dawning in her eyes was a mixture of absolute dread and pure, unadulterated awe. They are not communicating with each other via sonar. They are not using bioluminescence, and they are not using standard radio frequencies. That scout did not send a signal back to the central hive to ask for a new decryption key. It simply knew the new key, the exact microsecond its physical form touched the node. She pointed a rigid finger out at the terrifying black ocean. Quantum entanglement. They are not a swarm of individual, localized machines. They share a single, massive consciousness distributed across tens of thousands of separate physical bodies. We are dealing with a true hive mind connected perfectly at the subatomic level. The implications paralyzed me. If they shared one mind, they were a god of the deep. Cameron voiced my exact, terrifying conclusion. This is exactly why any form of physical retaliation is a guaranteed death sentence, she stated coldly. If I shoot one of those scouts with a high-yield plasma charge, every single entity in this entire trench will feel the thermal damage simultaneously. Attacking a single drone will instantly alert an army of 10,000 apex beasts. We cannot fight them with brute force. We have to fight them with mathematics. Cameron turned away from the void and waded toward the heavily armored, sealed nuclear bulkhead at the rear of the cabin. She grabbed a heavy kinetic wrench and began to violently disengage the magnetic locking mechanisms of the ship's engine room. "If we cannot break their bodies," Cameron said, hauling a massive cylindrical piece of hardware out of the reactor housing, "we will infect their mind." "What is that?" I asked, watching her drag the heavy object through the water. "This is the primary logic module of the submarine's nuclear reactor core," she replied. She hauled the heavy core onto the ruined navigation console and forcefully connected her suit's diagnostic cables directly into its primary ports. Her fingers began to fly across a virtual holographic keyboard projected from her wrist. "I have successfully recorded their decryption algorithm. I know exactly how they absorb and process external data. I am going to program a highly aggressive, polymorphic logic virus directly into the architecture of this nuclear battery." She stared intensely at the cascading lines of code on her visor. "I am going to code a destructive mathematical paradox. But a virus is completely useless if their biological firewall rejects it at the gate. So, I am going to wrap my logic virus in a very familiar package. I am going to disguise the entire malicious data payload to look exactly like the complex, telepathic brainwaves of Kalen." She looked back at the black water rushing past our broken ship. "They want a new central processor. We are going to hand-deliver them a poisoned one." The ruined submarine finally slammed violently against the absolute floor of the abyssal trench. The catastrophic impact jarred my bones, sending a fresh wave of freezing water over my head. I pulled myself up and stared through the shattered viewport. The crushing, featureless darkness of the deep ocean was entirely gone. We had finally reached the true lair. Before us stood a monolithic crystal formation easily the size of a sprawling human metropolis. It jutted out from the fractured basalt floor like a jagged, impossible tooth belonging to a dead god. It pulsed rhythmically with a sickening, freezing blue light that illuminated the black water for miles. The architecture was entirely devoid of any organic curvature. Every surface was sharp, mathematically precise, and endlessly fractal. Cascading down the sheer, towering cliffs of the central spire were millions of thick, translucent cables. They were massive fiber-optic veins, pulsing with bright, stolen energy, pumping raw life directly into the lightless bowels of the Silicon Nightmare. The moment our broken ship drifted into the outer perimeter of this underwater city, a catastrophic wave of invisible pressure slammed into my consciousness. It was the immense, collective weight of the hive mind. It was not a sound, nor was it a physical force. It was a crushing, agonizing pressure located entirely inside my skull. I felt millions of alien quantum calculations, tens of thousands of synchronized, unfeeling protocols, all screaming in absolute unison. The sheer scale of their collective intelligence was terrifyingly vast, a cosmic ocean of cold logic. My bioluminescence flickered violently, out of control. My skin cycled rapidly through terrified hues of pale green and stark white before settling into a dim, paralyzed, ashen gray. I collapsed entirely to the flooded metal deck of the command cabin. My limbs refused to obey my commands. My empathic mind was drowning in the sheer gravity of their alien thoughts. Cameron Blood did not possess my telepathic sensitivity. She was entirely blind to the invisible hurricane of psychic noise that was currently tearing my mind apart. She saw only the physical reality of her brutal calculus. She hauled the massive logic module of the nuclear reactor, now heavily infected with her polymorphic virus, onto her armored shoulder. Using heavy industrial synthetic straps, she physically bound the cumbersome, heavy metal cylinder directly to the reinforced titanium backplate of her deep-sea diving suit. Standing there in the freezing water, she looked impossibly small. She was a fragile speck of organic flesh, bone, and water, preparing to walk entirely alone into the heart of a cosmic, mechanical titan. Yet, contained within her rigid posture, was a terrifying, latent power that defied the massive scale of the enemy. She attached the heavy, umbilical breathing tubes to her helmet, locking them into place with a sharp click. Then, she reached down to the primary life support dial, located on her heavily armored chest plate. With slow, deliberate precision, she began to twist the valve backward, manually bleeding the precious oxygen from her primary tanks directly into the flooded cabin. "What are you doing?" I gasped, fighting against the crushing psychic weight to force the words through my auditory implant. "I analyzed the telemetry from the bait nodes very carefully," Cameron stated, her voice echoing with a hollow, metallic ring inside her helmet. "Their quantum entanglement is completely flawless for communication, but their internal biological firewall has a localized processing blind spot. When a drone crosses from the external ocean perimeter into the central processing core, there is a synchronization lag. It is a biological ping delay. It takes exactly 4 minutes for the central hive mind to fully register, scan, and authenticate a new thermal and biological signature entering the inner sanctum. If I mimic the baseline thermal decay of a damaged, returning drone, the system will categorize me as harmless background data for exactly 240 seconds. I am adjusting my oxygen mixture and thermal regulators to induce a state of extreme, controlled hypothermia. This will drastically lower my biological output to match their exact parameters." She locked the oxygen dial securely into place. "I have exactly 4 minutes of breathable air remaining in this suit. The window is absolute." She did not wait for me to process the terrifying reality of her plan. She turned her back on me and stepped directly out of the gaping hole in our hull, walking straight into the hyper-pressurized abyss. The sheer, physical weight of 4,000 atmospheres of black water should have crushed her human body into a microscopic singularity. But her heavy suit held firm. She began the long, agonizing walk across the fractured ocean floor, moving slowly toward the towering, glowing blue crystal spire. As she approached the massive, jagged archway of the central core, the shadows themselves began to detach from the crystal walls. Hundreds of gargantuan apex beasts, easily 10 times the massive size of the scouts that had attacked our ship, prowled the entrance. They were the Praetorian Guard of the Hive. They glided through the freezing water with terrifying, silent grace. Their massive angular silicon bodies reflected the cold blue light, creating a dizzying, fractal maze of moving mirrors. Cameron did not stop. She did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. She walked directly into the swarm of leviathans. She moved with a stiff, calculated rhythm, perfectly matching the exact hydrodynamic displacement of a dying machine. Her suit's thermal output was completely suppressed. Massive, jagged crystalline limbs brushed heavily against her armored shoulders. Formless, faceless heads swept closely over her helmet, silently searching the dark water for anomalies. The tension was an absolute, physical force. One irregular breath, one tiny spike of human adrenaline, one microscopic fluctuation in her body heat, and the entire swarm would instantly tear her into molecular dust. But her heart remained an icy, mechanical drum. She suppressed every human instinct she possessed. She slipped through the thick vanguard of terrifying monsters like a ghost constructed entirely of mathematics. She crossed the threshold and entered the vast, cavernous interior of the processing core. The sheer scale of the central chamber was staggering. Millions of thick, fiber-optic cables snaked rapidly across the jagged, geometric walls, all converging on a single, massive platform suspended in the center of the dark abyss. There, hanging helplessly in the cold void, was Kalen. He was trapped tightly within a horrific, glowing spiderweb of thick, translucent cables. The synthetic tendrils had burrowed deeply into his luminescent flesh, tapping violently into his neural cortex. He was being systematically drained. His once brilliant, blinding blue light had faded to a sickly, translucent pallor. His physical body was literally becoming transparent, dissolving slowly into raw data. Through our frayed, dying telepathic link, I felt the fading echo of his mind. His powerful mental heartbeat was no longer a strong, rhythmic pulse of life. It had been reduced to a series of faint, localized, agonizing gasps. He was slipping away into the dark, his entire consciousness being slowly devoured by the unfeeling hunger of the silicon god. Cameron reached the base of the central platform. She looked up at the dying light of my closest friend. She did not speak a single word. She reached behind her back and calmly unclasped the heavy locking mechanisms, holding the infected nuclear battery. The final countdown had reached its end. The exact second Cameron released the heavy straps of the nuclear battery, her 4 minutes of grace expired. The frozen ocean did not just shift, it violently erupted. The massive blue crystal spire recognized the foreign biological presence. The true core, the alpha entity, awakened from its dark slumber. It manifested not as a physical body, but as a catastrophic electromagnetic storm tearing through the hyper-pressurized water. Massive, razor-sharp pillars of black glass violently burst from the basalt floor, instantly sealing the cavern archway. There was no way out. Alpha was no longer fooled by the thermal suppression of the diving suit. The entity bypassed the physical armor entirely. A beam of localized, agonizing psychic force slammed directly into Cameron. Even without telepathic sensitivity, the sheer, blunt trauma of the mental strike forced her to her knees. Blood began to freely pour from her nose inside the helmet. The silicon god was preparing to rip her consciousness from her skull and consume her raw neural energy. But Cameron Blood did not cower. She did not attempt to flee, nor did she reach for a manual detonator to end their lives in a swift burst of nuclear fire. Fighting against a pressure that should have crushed her mind into dust, she lunged forward. She slammed the heavy, infected logic module directly into the primary, exposed data intake valve of the central altar. "Process this," she snarled, her voice a ragged, bleeding rasp. The polymorphic virus uploaded instantly into the central nervous system of the hive. But Cameron had not delivered a simple, destructive malware. She had delivered an infinite mathematical paradox, entirely encoded with the raw, chaotic, and heavily contradictory telemetry of the human emotional spectrum. She fed the perfect, unyielding crystal brain the exact mathematical equivalent of irrational sacrifice. She uploaded the illogical architecture of unconditional love and the chaotic, non-linear geometry of baseless, paralyzing fear. The crystalline mind immediately attempted to process the massive influx of data. It tried to categorize the concept of a fragile, organic creature willingly walking into a crushing abyss to save a single, statistically insignificant life. It tried to map the logic gates of a mother dying for her child, or a soldier holding a broken line against impossible odds. It was an absolute violation of pure logic. The perfect silicon brain could not compute the data, yet the virus forced it to continuously try, trapping the entire intelligence network in an inescapable feedback loop. The paradox triggered a catastrophic systemic failure. The entire city-sized structure screamed in a silent, agonizing digital dissonance. The blinding blue light rapidly shifted into a glaring, sickly white, and then abruptly died. The hive was entirely paralyzed. Cameron had calculated her variables perfectly. She had bought them exactly 30 seconds of total system blackout. The moment the network crashed, the massive fiber optic cables violently burrowing into Kalen hardened, crystallized, and then shattered into millions of harmless, drifting shards. His transparent body plummeted. Cameron caught him before he hit the platform. The sudden, violent cessation of the hive's thermal output created a massive, explosive updraft. The ocean current instantly reversed, creating a powerful vertical geyser. Cameron locked her heavily armored arms tightly around Kalen. She slammed her fist against her chest plate, deploying her suit's emergency ascension thrusters. They rode the explosive wave of displaced water directly up and out of the collapsing inner sanctum. They crashed violently through the shattered glass pillars of the entrance and slammed hard into the open airlock of our waiting submarine. I instantly engaged the emergency pneumatic ballast purge. We shot upward, like a kinetic projectile, tearing through the dark water, leaving the paralyzed silicon god to rot in the abyss. Minutes later, we violently breached the surface of Gliese 884. The terrible, crushing pressure was finally gone. Natural, unfiltered air flooded the main cabin. Kalen gasped violently. His luminescent skin rapidly shifted from a dead, ashen gray to a brilliant, life-affirming azure blue. He opened his eyes. He was alive. At that exact moment, the terrifying, mechanical shell of Cameron Blood simply vanished. The icy predator of the deep ceased to exist. She dropped heavily to the metal deck. She reached up with trembling hands and tore her helmet off. Her face was pale, covered in sweat and dried blood. Then, her entire body began to shake with a violent, uncontrollable tremor. She curled into a tight, fragile ball against the bulkhead, buried her face in her bare hands, and began to sob. It was a raw, primal, and deeply agonizing sound of absolute exhaustion and terror. I watched the human weep helplessly on the floor, and finally, the ultimate truth of the Deathworlders dawned on my mind. Her cold, calculated indifference down in the dark was never a lack of empathy. It was the absolute pinnacle of love. She had violently strangled every ounce of her own humanity, crushing her own blinding fear and crippling grief into a sharpened weapon, just so she could drag the one she loved directly out of the jaws of death. Thank you so much for listening to today's story, dear friends. Where in the universe are you listening from right now? Please let us know in the comments below. If you found this tale captivating, please consider supporting our channel with just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the Donate QR code currently on your screen, or by using the link in the video description or the pinned comment. Your kindness directly pays the salaries of our hardworking staff, helping them feed their families and allowing us to keep creating better and better stories for you. Thank you, and stay safe out there in the stars.